Committee meeting. I call this Auditor General Committee meeting of Thursday, October 17th, 2024 to order. This committee meeting is being convened by electronic means as authorized under Part 14 of the Procedure Bylaw. As such, committee members may participate in person or by electronic means. If any committee member loses their connection during the voting process, we have staff on hand to facilitate getting you back online quickly while we suspend the voting process. The contact information has been circulated to you. Members of the public can view the proceedings via the live stream and YouTube link, which will be posted on X at Van City Clerk. Video of committee members speaking, presentations, amendments, and vote results will be projected to viewers when available. If attending virtually, committee members are reminded to please enable their video to ensure quorum is maintained during the meeting under Section 14.13 of the Procedure Bylaw. External members of the committee can access the speaking queue by clicking the raise hand icon on the WebEx, or raise your hand, or use the Creston panel. In the case of an emergency where we need to evacuate the building, I'd like to direct your attention to the exits. There are 2 exits beyond the glass doors and to the left. If the glass doors are obstructed, please direct your attention to the 4 exits in this chamber. Please use the stairs, do not use the elevator. I'd also like to highlight that there is a defibrillator located at the end of the hallway outside of Council Chamber. We acknowledge that we are on the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We thank them for having cared for this land and look forward to working with them in partnership as we continue to build this great city together. I also want to take a moment to recognize the immense contributions of the City of Vancouver staff who work hard every day to help make our city an incredible place to live, work, and play. Clerk, can we have the roll call, please?
Yes, Councillor Kirby-Young. Councillor Dominato. Councillor Fry is in the chair. Councillor Boyle has a leave of absence due to personal reasons. Councillor Montague. I see Councillor Montague online there. And Councillor Joe.
Present.
External Representative Archie Johnston is absent today, had indicated he would be absent. External Representative Carol Bellringer. I see online. And External Representative Sophia Sui. You have quorum, Chair Fry.
Thanks, Clerk. And just to confirm, we do have audio for our virtual attendees?
It was a little glitchy.
Oh, okay.
It was a little glitchy there for a second, but we have it now.
Great. Okay. Thanks. Okay, great. Thanks, Clerk. And before we begin, have some announcements. Any comments on the agenda item can be sent to the committee using the web form on the city's website. The link to that form will be posted on X at Van City Clerk. I also want to note the City of Vancouver's longstanding commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion, including utmost respect for all genders. I remind committee members that when addressing speakers and staff, we will avoid using gendered honorifics and instead refer to the person by first and last name, role, or title. Finally, I'd like to remind committee members that if an amendment is brought forward, it must be submitted to the clerk in final written form before the committee member introduces it. Please ensure the clerk has received your amendment by emailing it directly to Kevin Burris. Today, there are 2 items on the agenda. The first is the update June 2024 follow-up report, AGC requested work. I will now invite the Auditor General, Mike McDonnell, to introduce and present the item, along with Laurie Berndt, Deputy Auditor General, and Dr. Lorinda Stoneman, Senior Auditor. We also have from the Vancouver Police Board, Executive Director Jason Kuzminski, and from the Vancouver Police Department, Superintendent Tyrone Sideroff, Information Services, and Drazen Manojlovic, Director, Enterprise Risk Management. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Fry. The audit work conducted by my office is performed to what's called a reasonable level of assurance that's set out in the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada Handbook and the CPA Canada Standards on Quality Management. This means that you can have confidence that any statement contained in any of my audit reports has sufficient and appropriate supporting evidence. On the other hand, the audit follow-up process, which is the responsibility of this committee and which I conduct on your behalf, consists of representations from management on the status of implementing audit recommendations. As such, I provide no assurance on the completeness or accuracy of these self-assessments. It's up to you to ask questions of management about their representations, and this process only works if you do. At the June 20th AGC meeting, you did ask questions. Next slide, please. You also passed a series of motions asking me to do further work related to management's representations. And the motions were as follows. The committee asked that I obtain a copy of the jurisdictional scan included in management's action plan related to recommendation 2 of the audited building permit fees, and provide the committee with observations relating to the adequacy of the scan to support options to improve building permit fee process. The committee asked that I continue to follow up and report back on the status of implementation of recommendations specific to the Park Board revenue management. The committee also asked that I continue to follow up and report back on the status of implementation of recommendations contained in the Vancouver Police Department's Enterprise Risk Management Report. And further on that one, that I obtain a copy of the risk register and report back on my assessment of it. Our work consisted of meetings with representatives from the city departments, the police board, and the police department, as well as a review of documentation. We examined key documents that either the committee specifically asked us to look at or that were provided by departments in support of the reports to you. It's essential that the committee understands that this work was not conducted with the intention of meeting the requirements of any assurance standard, and this does not constitute an audit. You asked me to look at some things, and I'm reporting back on what my team and I did as simply and as efficiently as possible. The first part of your motion, you asked me to look at the jurisdictional scan referenced in DBL's update. DBL provided my team with the jurisdictional scan referenced in their June update that compares Vancouver's approach to building permit fees with the approaches of Coquitlam, Richmond, Surrey, Hamilton, Mississauga, Ottawa, and Toronto. The scan outlined the method of calculation, the tools used to validate the results, when fees are collected, and an analysis of the pros and cons of the approaches used by each jurisdiction. Based on this analysis, the scan outlined 3 guiding principles for the method Vancouver should adopt. Vancouver's process should be first, transparent, straightforward for applicants to understand. Second, it should be clear for staff to understand and to administer. And thirdly, it should be consistent, reliable, equitable, and efficient. DBL also provided a summary of 3 potential options with a recommendation to adopt a unique calculation methodology that considers gross floor area and type of use. This documentation fully supports management's representations in the June 2024 follow-up report. In the second part of your motion, you asked me to continue to follow up and report back to the committee on the status and implementation of recommendations related to Park Board revenue. In their June update, the Park Board noted that they had begun by focusing on the Bladel Conservatory, but the committee expressed some concern with the pace of implementation. I met with Park Board staff who explained that they do not yet have a full understanding of service baselines, demand curves, the true cost of delivering services, or the degree of subsidy currently provided. An understanding of all of these things is needed before policy decisions can be made regarding the appropriate level of subsidy and then the appropriate fees to charge. The board has only just started collecting information needed to obtain this understanding for the 270 service lines that it has identified as part of this exercise. Bladel is being used as a test case because of the discrete nature of its operations and the manageable scale. The board was candid that it had a long way to go and that it will take a period of years to fully implement my recommendations across all service lines. It knows it can't do this all at once and that it needs to prioritize. I accept these representations and look forward to hearing more about the Park Board's progress in future semi-annual follow-ups. In the third part of your motion, you asked me to continue to follow up and report back to the committee on the status and implementation of the recommendations contained in the VPD Enterprise Risk Management Report, and specifically to obtain a copy of the risk register and report back to the committee on my assessment of it. My team's work consisted of meetings with representatives from the police board and the department, and a review of documentation supporting management's assertions contained in the follow-up report. Materials included board meeting materials from January to July of 2024, the department's prototype corporate risk register, the ERM policy and ERM categories, VPD's risk appetite statement, and the Board Finance Committee terms of reference. We found evidence supporting the self-assessments provided by the VPD and the Board in relation to progress on 6 out of a total of 9 recommendations. That information is summarized here in that slide there. Thanks, Elise. The first 3 recommendations in this list were directed at the Police Board. Recommendations 6, 7, and 9 were directed at the department. I don't intend to walk through this in detail, but include it here in case you have any questions of the board or department on these items. However, for 3 of the 9 recommendations, we weren't able to identify evidence supporting the board and management's assertions that the recommendations have been fully or substantially implemented at the time of the follow-up. The available information pointed to a lesser level of implementation than had been presented. Recommendation 2 was directed at the board and relates to the board requiring the Chief Constable to establish, maintain, and obtain board approval of an ERM framework, including a policy and a risk register. The board indicated that it had fully or substantially implemented this recommendation. The evidence provided showed that VPD had begun ERM work and engaged the board, but it hadn't yet implemented this recommendation through adopting rules pursuant to Section 28 of the Police Act that include new requirements for the chief in relation to enterprise risk management or amending the board governance manual. We understand that the board intends to consider this draft policy that addresses this recommendation as early as this month. Given that the work is underway rather than completed, we suggest an assessment of partially implemented would more fairly represent progress rather than fully or substantially implemented as had been presented. For recommendation 5 relates to the development of an ERM framework and policy. The department indicated that it had fully implemented this recommendation. We noted that, as represented, the department had adopted the International Standards Organization, or ISO 31000, as its ERM standard. ISO 31000 provides principles and guidance for organizations to develop and implement their own customized risk management framework. However, the department indicated that it had not yet developed a documented, customized organizational ERM framework in alignment with the standard and with our recommendation. We also noted that the department had developed an ERM policy that the board approved on June 20th, 2024. The policy included some, but not all of the elements of the recommendation. Given that work was underway rather than completed, we suggest that an assessment of partially implemented would more fairly represent progress in implementation rather than having been fully implemented. Recommendation 8 relates to the development of a risk register. VPD indicated that it had fully implemented the recommendation. As requested by you, we obtained and assessed a copy of the fall 2023 risk register referred to in the self-reported status update. We found that the department's planning, research, and audit section had presented a prototype corporate risk register to the board in November of 2023, in advance of the VPD's Director of Enterprise Risk Management actually starting with the department. The prototype also preceded the VPD's ERM policy, the endorsement of ISO 31000, the selection of risk categories, and the VPD's risk appetite statement, and was presented for information and feedback only. VPD had not yet made updates to the initial prototype and is not using it to track the status of risk responses or mitigation strategies. For example, it wasn't included in any of the available board agenda, minutes, or materials from January to July 2024. If it had been implemented, we expect it would have been used to provide the status updates on enhanced risk responses in place during the early part of the year. That said, the document had some appropriate elements of an effective risk register as well as some opportunities for improvement. For example, the document listed risks within specific categories and included inherent risk scores, as well as existing mitigation strategies and controls. It also included residual risk scores. The VPD had identified risk owners for all but 2 of the risks identified. We identified opportunities for the department to improve the risk register that they may wish to consider as they evolve the prototype. For example, all risk action plans should be just that, plans of action that are tied to timelines and completion dates. Recognizing these may change over time, this will help communicate key information about risk treatments and set the stage for risk monitoring. We suggest a status of partially implemented would be a more accurate representation of the level of implementation rather than fully implemented. And as VPD scales up its ERM operation, there's an opportunity to revisit the development of a risk register in order to fully implement the recommendation. My recommendations were intended to assist the board and the department establish a strong foundation to effectively implement enterprise risk management. Foundational work of this nature takes time to do well. I'm encouraged by the work underway and recognize that it may take some time before a robust ERM policy and a comprehensive risk register are formally in place and adopted. I also recognize that enterprise risk management is part of a maturity process and that the requisite tools are not intended to be static in form. I expect that once new tools are in place, the department will revisit them over time and refine and advance the processes it uses. Normally, I don't continue to follow up on recommendations that have been reported as fully implemented. But given the evidence provided, I intend to include recommendations 2, 5, and 8 in my next follow-up, which will be presented to you in December. So this is the end of my prepared remarks. We have representatives from at least the board here in attendance today. Now would be a good time to ask them any questions that you may have. I'd also like to ask you, whether this process meets your needs. This is the first run through of it. So any comments and feedback you have on that would be very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. And I neglected to also mention, not in my script, but we also have for benefit of folks online, we have the General Manager of Parks and Recreation, Steve Jackson, here, and City Manager Paul Mookery is also here with us today. Okay, so on to questions. I will advance Councillor Kirby-Young.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And thank you, Mike, for the report and the overview. And yeah, I'll say off the bat, I think this is a really important process for the committee to be exercising its due diligence in not just approving an audit plan, but looking at the results of the audit and then seeing are things being implemented and how is that going. So I think that sort of circle of audit or circle of activity is important. I'm going to start with a couple of questions, and I want to start first around the 3 recommendations with the VPD, and just reflecting back what I heard. What I'm hearing is that in the past, without sort of this request from the committee, it was sort of the honor system. If the subject of an audit, for example, said a recommendation been fully implemented, that it was sort of accepted. And in looking at a deep dive, I'm a bit concerned to hear things like on the ERM framework, if I've understood this correctly, and I think I'm paraphrasing, you said the board had said it was fully adopted, but in fact it was not. And then for the risk register, that it wasn't an actual risk register, but a prototype, which is really an idea or a concept, right? Which is not implementation. So I wonder if you can speak a bit more to kind of the impact of characterizing something as complete and the nature of these risks remaining unaddressed.
Well, thank you, Councillor Kirby-Young, for the question. You're right. You use the term honor system, and it is very much the honor system when management self-reports, which is why when the information is presented to you, it needs to be read with perhaps a degree of professional skepticism and asking appropriate questions. Am I particularly bothered by this juncture? Not really. It's new. And I think this is part of the learning process that when representations are put forward, that they will be subject to that professional skepticism and review by this committee. And I think that in that sense, then the process becomes self-policing. And so to my mind, it's actually working as it should.
So will you continue to provide the committee with updates on these? Because as a member of the committee, it does disturb me in terms of, perhaps it's characterization, perhaps it's over-enthusiasm, or perhaps it's sort of a lack of a perspective on what constitutes an effective implementation or risk register, but it does certainly leave doubts and questions in my mind.
Normal practice for us is when a recommendation has been reported by management as having been fully implemented, that it then drops off of our list for follow-up. But I will continue to follow up on the 3 recommendations, one to the board and 2 to the department, that had been presented as fully implemented. I will continue to follow up on those in December, so you'll get another update on those in a couple of months.
Okay, I would appreciate that as a member of the committee. And I appreciate you flagging those sort of outstanding pieces or discrepancies. I'm going to move on to another question around the park board. And you sort of cited it was a long-term piece of work in terms of the fee structure and really understanding the full levels of subsidy, setting fees, et cetera, and that the intention would start with Blodell Conservatory. I'm curious, I know that the Blodell has a closure, for example, currently or imminently around redoing pathways, those kinds of things. So I'm just a bit curious from a pragmatic perspective how that work is implemented. Is it relevant if the facility is fully operational, if it's shut down for a period of time? Does that make sense just because it's convenient, because it's an ecosystem to use Blodell, which in my mind is a very specialized type of facility? It's not a representative facility of the majority of the parks and rec system that the general public interact with. They think of, when they think the Vancouver Park Board, they think of community centers, pools, ice rinks, the majority of activities. Like, I don't think that the Blodell is a good case study in terms of being representative of how folks interact with services. It might be a convenient one in terms of the ecosystem. So I'm wondering if you have perspective around that.
I don't, but I think perhaps a better perspective might come from the parks general manager, who just happens to be here today. If
Okay. Thanks, Steve.
That's the mic. Good morning. Yeah, so choosing Blodell is actually about a learning experience for our staff going through this process, more so than meaningful change in how we operate our services and systems. Again, we've categorized 270 discrete services that the park board operates. Those are within 5 different service categories. So Blodell.
Chair, sorry, before I run out of time, can I move for a second round?
Certainly me. Yes. All in favor? Opposed? Seeing
Thanks.
none.
I may have to come back for that answer. I'm at time. Thanks.
Sure.
Thanks, Councillor Kirby-Young. Councillor Dominato.
Thanks, Chair. A couple of questions. Thank you for the update. One was just following up on the 3 recommendations directed at VPD. You noted, and maybe this is a question for Executive Director, but that the board intends to consider its draft policy that addresses the recommendation 2 in October imminently. Is that confirmed? Is that maybe a question I should be directing to the Executive Director?
Question better posed to the board.
Thank you very much. And first, I just would like to say that Jason Murray, the chair of the Finance and Risk Committee, intended to be here, but was unfortunately had a scheduling conflict and asked me to appear in his stead. And the answer to the question is yes. The Finance and Risk Committee actually, as a conduit to getting material to the board, passed a resolution that the board require the chief constable to establish, maintain, and obtain board feedback on and approval of an ERM framework, including a policy and risk register. That motion, and following the board's governance policies and practices, that committee resolution will come to the board at its next meeting on October 31st.
Okay.
And it's anticipated it'll be approved on consent.
Okay, that's great to hear. I had a further question related to recommendation 8, related to the risk register. Noting it says that VPD prototype corporate risk register go to the board November 23rd, 2023, prior to VPD's chief risk officer starting. Has the chief risk officer started with VPD?
Yes, and I believe he's actually on the line, Drazen Menelovich.
Okay. Well, in that case, I am curious about maybe the delays in fully implementing the risk register, given that VPD has actively been talking in the public about risks that they're grappling with. And so I'm just wondering, what is the timeline for this to be fully implemented?
If Drazen is available, he probably can speak to that a little more definitively. But I would say as well, it's important to distinguish some of the risks we're talking about aren't necessarily enterprise risks, and some of them might be more the actual area of risk that the VPD have been managing and successfully managing for a long time. Enterprise risk management is a bit of a new to the policing environment, and I think, as the auditor said, it's a learning process, so that accounts for some of the delay.
Okay. Is there anything further from the chief risk officer?
Yes, hello. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. We definitely, right now we have 32 risks in our enterprise risk management register. And the feedback that we got from the Auditor General, I definitely intend to incorporate, and ideally by, I would say, April or May of next year, and make those improvements on that. I do want to say, though, that the risk owners that have responsibility for the various enterprise risks have been working on them all throughout this year. And it's just a matter of getting the information about what they've been able to do about these risks and incorporating them into a new risk register that incorporates the recommendations for improvement that the Auditor General has.
Okay, thank you. That's all my questions, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Domina. Thanks, Strazen. Councillor Kirby-Young, back up.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I have a follow-up as well, and probably to the Chief Risk Officer for the VPD. And I'm just wondering if you can give us a bit of a perspective on the approach to dealing with the risk opportunities and issues that were identified in the audit. And are you utilizing, I know that I believe you have quite a history with the VPD. Are you engaging in bringing in outside expertise in this risk work? If this is a relatively new, just following on your comment, it's relatively new to the VPD in a new area. I'm just wondering if that's more of an internally focused or resourced effort, or if you're also bringing in outside expertise with specific bench strength in this function.
To answer Councillor, to answer the sort of the second part of your question first, yes, in an informal way. So, for example, I've established relationships with the city's enterprise risk manager and also the University of British Columbia, and also consultants who have expertise in enterprise risk management in the public sector and also in policing. So we haven't brought them in a, hey, we need some help. How much would you charge for this help to establish, to better our enterprise risk management program? That is a possibility. That's something that may be a business case that I would present to our executive and our board should the time arise. But since I've arrived in February, I've definitely leaned on them and picked these individuals' brains about what are the appropriate steps to move forward. So it's kind of to be quite honest, it's a bit of a yes and no answer. We haven't just done it in-house. We're looking towards best practices in public sector, et cetera. Now, I apologize. The first part of your question, if you don't mind repeating it.
No, I think that you're touching on it. I guess I'm just wondering, is this a bit of a question of the doctor trying to heal themselves? And if this is a new competency, a new area of development, just like you bring in engineers, for example, because they have expertise in ensuring a building is sound, how would council and in this audit function have confidence that all of the key areas are being addressed if this is not a competency that was available internally? I guess that's my question. Is there a benefit, or are you looking to be more formal and bringing in outside expertise as opposed to informally?
I think we would definitely consider it. I mean, we obviously want to establish an enterprise risk management program that is robust, that would pass any kind of scrutiny. And as the Auditor General mentioned, it does take time. So at this stage right now, I would say don't think it's necessary for the first half of into next year. We're focusing on training our senior managers on the fundamentals of risk management. And then the other big part of enterprise risk management is risk assessment. And we have all of the ability and knowledge to properly assess, evaluate, analyze, and score and assess how those risks are going.
That's intriguing. I'm going to leave it there and save some time for now, and I'll let Councillor Fry go. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Councillor Kirby-Young. Yeah, I'm going to just follow up on the policing piece first, and just to give a lens, and this could be to anyone, when we talk about enterprise risk management and putting it into kind of lay terms, one of the big sort of new budget considerations is overtime and overages that are coming forward against this budget. Is an enterprise risk management framework designed to sort of better anticipate the staffing needs and that kind of piece so that we're maybe not faced with unexpected, recognizing things happen and we have, a variety of factors that would influence the need for overtime callouts? Is that part of what an ERM does?
Well, it could. The reality of the overtime costs, et cetera. So, for example, I'll give you a specific example. Demonstrations and protests are a key driver of our overtime costs. That kind of issue is definitely within the ERM framework and within our ERM register. And the task of going through an assessment in terms of, are we appropriately dealing with such issues, would be in an ERM framework. So yes, important drivers that lead to overtime or budgetary issues would definitely be in an ERM framework, and hopefully there would be solutions that would mitigate those. So short answer is yes.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks, Dresden. And then shifting gears somewhat to the parks, and this was sort of following up, I think, where Councillor Kirby-Young was going with some of her questions. And so the example of the Lodell Conservatory, obviously very unique property in the entire city versus more sundry offerings like rinks and community center swimming pools, that kind of thing. How do these stack up? Are we talking apples to oranges or grapefruits?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. So again, a big piece of this is just allowing, through a more simplified example, for staff to go through the process of full costing, understanding drivers. But if you take Blodell, it actually does incorporate many aspects that our more larger services offer. So you're talking about opening, closing hours, maintenance of plants, adapting to tourism and the fluctuations that come from that visitation. We've got the REFM components as well in terms of building maintenance. So there's a lot in that space to be evaluated in terms of trying to understand full costing. How do we then map our response to service demands, being the customers, and then you layer on events, filming, and the ancillary aspects of it too, parking nearby. So there is actually a lot there to dive into, and I think we'll learn a lot through that to then apply it to the more broader services like our park maintenance and community centers.
And just sort of in that future consideration, because my understanding is community centers in particular have revenue sharing with the community center association, so that adds a whole other level of that expectation, presumably?
Well, exactly. And Blodell, you take that, again, we've got our relationship with Vancouver Botanical Garden Association and in joint operating that facility. So there's learnings there as well that I think will be able to be applied to our CCA environment.
Okay, and I wasn't aware of the botanical, I think I was, but I was not immediately, so thank you for that. Okay, that's good for me. I see Sophia has put herself on the queue.
Yes, my mic, oh, the microphone is
You're on.
working. Thank you. So just, I think the AG office has been in place for a couple of years now, and I think it has found a number of very useful findings. I guess it is somewhat concerning to not have appropriate follow-up on, findings that are quite valuable. What I'm used to seeing when there are findings is there's always a design element, but I think the important piece is the embedded element, which is the ongoing effectiveness of, the finding. So, if there isn't anyone looking at it, it's back to this honor system, and I think it's a missed opportunity because there's been a number of very useful findings. I don't know if that will be in your office and hence ultimately will be a budget request to do the follow-up. The other way to approach it is risk rating of the findings so that you are checking the ones that are the most important and probably the most impactful. And I think just a comment on Councillor Fry's question around the ERM, it should help to, if you are risk rating things, that does help you to marshal where the focus needs to be, where the resources needs to be. So a full functioning system actually is important.
Well, thanks for those observations. Much appreciated. Finding the right path for follow-up is a challenge, not just for my office, but for offices of auditors general across the country at all levels. And you'll find that there's no consistency between offices, whether they're provincial, federal, or municipal auditors general or equivalent at the municipal level, on how to follow up on it. And the reason for that is largely because there's a reluctance on the part of many of my peers to speak to something unless they've actually audited it. And so the follow-up process that we have is somewhat unique with the self-assessment. The alternative is that recommendations don't get followed up on. I harken back to about a year and a half ago, I heard one of my colleagues lament that, recommendations had been sitting out there for a decade without any action on it, but that office doesn't actually have a follow-up process of any kind. And so what I'm trying to find is an effective balance between keeping our eye on the ball and best deployment of limited resources. So to my mind, going in and reperforming an audit is something that would only be appropriate in very rare circumstances. And, you know, that would be where we have serious concerns about how previous recommendations may have been implemented across the board as opposed to in particular areas. My office hasn't been around long enough for me to develop those concerns. 3 years and 1 month so far we've been in existence. That is something that could be assessed further over time. In terms of identifying risk, that's actually part of the discussion here, though, with this committee. It's actually this committee's, in the terms of reference, responsibility to follow up, not mine. I do it on your behalf. And so that's why this process, these conversations, the questions that you ask of management are absolutely critical to this being an effective and efficient process. So that's the balance that I've landed on, rather than going and reperforming the work, devoting my resources to exploring new audit topics. But there may come a time when that's not the appropriate action. And I think that will be something that will be determined through further conversations right here in this room with this committee. And, you know, I welcome that input, and that's what I'm asking for. So thanks for those observations. I really appreciate it, Sophia.
Thanks, Sophia. Done? Okay, thank you. Next, Carol Bellringer.
Thank you. It's a question as well for the Auditor General, and I too am processing the process. Do you have an estimate of about how much time it took to do that follow-up for us?
Lori, do we have any sort of hours on that? Do we have any hours? Yeah, I could only give you a ballpark estimate, Carol. You know, it's probably a total of, I don't know, 2-person weeks, I guess, to do what we've done with this particular piece, perhaps a little more.
So I'm sorry, I'm assuming I can still talk. And that's just something I'm thinking about, because if you compare that to the time of the committee, we don't have 2-person weeks worth of time available to ask questions. So it is harder, and it does mean we can't see the underlying documents and things. So I mean, we can ask for them, but we may need to ask you to follow up other things in the future. And at this point, I'm just mentioning it as a comment, and certainly we can discuss it again with the next follow-up report. Thank you for doing that work for this one. It was helpful.
Thanks, Carol.
Thanks, Carol. Seeing nobody else on the queue, and this item was for information only, so there's no motion required per 5.16 of the procedure bylaw. And seeing no one else in the queue, we can move on to the next item. Thanks, everybody. The last item on the agenda is the Office of the Auditor General 2025 budget request. And I'm now going to invite the Auditor General, Mike McDonnell, to introduce and present the item.
Thanks again, Chair Fry. Just a reminder for the committee, the process for council review and approval of my office's budget is described in the Auditor General bylaw, which requires me to present a budget request to this committee for your review. This committee is in turn required to recommend an appropriation for my office to council for them to consider. Accordingly, today I'm presenting a budget request with a recommendation to endorse that I hope you'll approve. This slide here, I'll start with a report on my office's projected expenditures for 2024 compared to the council approved budget for the year. As you can see in this slide, I've been able to achieve modest savings against budget for salaries and support costs, but most notably for contracted services. I'll speak to contracted services in the next slide because it represents a unique component of my budget that bears further explanation. The engagement of appropriate subject matter expertise for each audit we conduct is required under Canadian audit standards, the framework my office follows in accordance with our operating license from CPA British Columbia. In my budget request to you last year, I asked for an allowance to contract subject matter expertise to support my audit teams under the proviso that if the funds weren't needed, they wouldn't be spent. And I've fulfilled that commitment to the tune of almost $100,000. I ask for an allowance in this area because it's not possible to know the exact type of expertise my office will require or its cost. There are two reasons for this. First, while I have an audit program, which indicates the topics I intend to look at, the plan can and has changed as priorities change. And second, even if my office's work schedule exactly followed the plan, the nature of expertise required in any individual audit isn't known until we determine the scope of work and understand the expertise that's actually going to be required. Along with the professional audit standards we follow, applying appropriate subject matter expertise is the foundation on which the credibility of my work rests. I hope you'll continue to support this approach since I know of no better way to conduct the work to fulfill my mandate. So for 2025, I'm requesting a total budget of $2,533,000 to fund the operations of the Office of the Auditor General. This represents an increase of $121,000 or 5% over the current year. Salaries and benefits comprise the largest component of costs by far, 86% of total expenditures. The budget includes a total increase of $130,000 in compensation related costs, comprised entirely of cost of living and merit increases. These increases conform to the city's compensation plan for excluded staff and are non-discretionary. The budget includes a reduction in contracted services totaling $7,000 with an additional $3,000 for support costs. All of the savings relate to things I felt I could trim, things like desktop publishing and supplies, offset by an allowance for inflation in each area. As in prior years, we've continued to occupy a city-owned building rather than paying market rent. Any acquired furnishings have come used from city stores. We continue to use the city's human resources and information technology support functions rather than contracting out with third parties. That would be more expensive, but it could also be justified for an office that operates independent of the city's administration. Training has largely been delivered in-house, although it's fair to say we've reached the limit of what we can reasonably do ourselves. We've also found that we've been able to produce our own reports formatted with adequate quality without the assistance of external contractors. We also invited the city's internal audit group to piggyback on the audit software platforms that are currently being put in place. This doesn't necessarily save my office any money, but it does represent a benefit to the city as a whole, or what I call thinking like a taxpayer. I'm sorry for the small numbers in this slide, but the last thing I'd like to leave you with is a reminder about the value add that my team strives for. Currently, we estimate a return of $3.37 for every dollar invested in my office since day one, with a longer-term estimated total return of $79 million compared to a total spend of $5 million. While very much an estimate, nonetheless, this demonstrates the potential for significant benefit to the city. In other words, the monies invested in my office to date have been well spent. And while this doesn't provide me with unlimited license to spend, I hope it suggests that my modest budget request is worthy of your support. So to close, this slide has my budget request, which I hope you'll support with the following resolution. That the Auditor General Committee endorse the Auditor General's budget request of $2,533,000 to fund the operations of the Office of the Auditor General for 2025. Further, that the endorsement be recommended to Council for approval.
Thanks, Mike. Members, you have up to 5 minutes to ask questions. Are there any questions? I see Councillor Kirby-Young.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, I do have questions. First of all, thanks for, I love the frugality in terms of the internal costs and the desktop printing. I have a couple questions. The first one is around looking at your approved 2024 budget and your actual, and I see that you underspent by $182,000, and yet you are basing your 2025 budget on the 2024 approved budget, which therefore shows it's an increase of only 121, but it's, I guess, actually around 300 odd based on what you actually spent. So I'm wondering if you can give us some context around those pieces, because you obviously did a fantastic job and spent less.
The underspend on salaries was because of an unplanned vacancy. And so it was a rather small shop, and if one person leaves and this position sits vacant for a period of months, so we find a replacement, that has a rather significant impact on the overall budget, given we don't have a large group of people. So I budget with the expectation of being fully staffed and not having vacancies. So that would be probably the largest component. The other piece is the contracted services, which, as I described in the presentation, is an allowance. And my expectation this year is that we probably will use more of that allowance this year based on the nature of the work that I plan to do, particularly in the IT security space.
Right. Okay. Bringing in the external needed expertise. Okay, that's great. And then, so I appreciate that. My other question is really around this ROI piece, which is really encouraging to see. And I wonder if you can just give us a little bit more detail or color on that in terms of, are these projected savings versus implementation in terms of the ROI? Can you just flesh that out in layman's terms for people?
Sure.
Thanks.
Well, first of all, I'll start by saying that I'm one of two offices, Auditor General offices in the country that goes through this exercise, the other one being the Auditor General of Toronto, who's required to do it under her enabling legislation. I feel it's just it's a good thing to do. And so that's why we're doing this. These are projections. They're based on our understanding of the actions that management could take, tempered by the actions that management has taken. So they're our best guess of what the impact should be based on our understanding at that moment in time. I can tell you actually that some of the numbers have already changed, but it was too late to get them in this presentation. It's an ongoing exercise based on, say, for instance, what comes before council, what council approves. So say for building permit fees, the return is actually much higher than...
Oh, that's the shakeout drill. Can I get my timer stopped now? Thanks.
This is the Great British Columbia Shakeout. You are joining thousands of British Columbians in the largest earthquake drill in Canadian history. Right now, drop, cover, and hold on. Drop to the ground. Take cover under a sturdy piece of furniture. Hold on until the shaking stops. If you can't get yourself in, stay low and protect your head. Using your arms. Stronger flinch like trigger tsunami. If you're near the ocean during the earthquake, drop, cover, and hold on. When the shaking stops, quickly walk to high ground. The shaking has stopped. Now count to 60 to allow objects near you time to stop moving. Consider the following questions. Are you prepared? Do you have an emergency kit stocked with enough food, water, and supplies for everyone in your home? Have you secured your belongings so they will not fall and injure you during a strong earthquake? Do you have a plan to reunite with family if the phones are interrupted? For more information on emergency preparedness, visit the website shakeoutbc.ca. Thank you for taking part in the Great British Columbia Shakeout.
Oh. Thanks. Hope everybody's okay. At least one shakeout injury. Councillor Dominato.
I'm looking forward to rewatching the video of this after to see how high I jumped when the bell went off.
Right.
Shall
We're
I resume?
restarting the timer.
Shall I resume, Chair? Sorry, if we can pick up on that thread, just to stitch that back together for people around projected savings and depends on implementation.
And so the numbers are constantly in flux and in motion. I was talking about how with building permit fees that actually we achieved much greater financial return than I was initially expecting, based on the speed with which you endorsed a change in the actual rates that were being charged, so incremental revenues that were coming into the city. So, like I said, I have an estimate when we first put our recommendations out, and every 6 months or so, my team goes and has another look at them and to see that does this still make sense. They have conversations with management to say, what are your plans going forward? What are things looking like? Does this look reasonable to you?
So on
that being said, there are numbers, not management. So
yeah, so on that note, just while I have time left, is in the spirit of the follow-up theme discussion this morning, interested in your advice on whether this is something the committee should be asking for, getting regular updates on in terms of, as those numbers change, that we're not just getting this in a budget once a year, but what is the best frequency or way to get updates
right now,
around that?
You're going to be getting it twice a year. So once in the budget request, we're having this conversation. And I also included in my annual report. If you'd like, I can speak to it more frequently. But the reality is that it's an exercise in fine tuning. The big chunks come in, as we've had the reports out as they go along. So I'm not sure there's a regular cadence that actually would work.
Does it make sense to have kind of a standing total as reports are updated?
We could.
As a standing update item on committee agendas?
We could try to do that. That again, I guess I'd have to ask if that's a real great benefit to you, because it takes us away from doing our other work.
Okay, well, I'd be interested in hearing more back about that if that's something that your team wanted to give consideration to. Thanks.
Councillor Dominato.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for the budget presentation and request. I think it's really clear, and I think the value that office offers the city, I think, is fantastic. I do have more of a broader question. I know you're greatly familiar with the Office of the Auditor General for BC, as well as the former Auditor General Office for Local Government, which ceased operations in 2021. It seems to me we put this in place because we believed it was the right thing to do and it would be a benefit for not only the residents but taxpayers. And we're obviously funding the office. But from your viewpoint, is this something the provincial government should be contributing to in terms of operations? Because not every municipality would be in a position to necessarily be funding their own office. And there was an Auditor General for local government in the past. And so is this something that we should be looking to the province to play a role in terms of supporting? And again, that's a bit more of a sort of maybe an ideological question, but it seems to me we had an office in place provincially. It ceased operations, and I don't know that every municipality is in the same position financially to be able to do what we're doing. And I think it's the right thing to do. And I wouldn't change it, but I think curious what your thoughts are on that.
I believe there was a discussion at Surrey recently about putting an AG in place, which their council declined to move forward on. What you're asking me, Councillor Dominato, is really a question around policy, and I'm afraid that's not something that I'm comfortable really speaking to. I speak to the work that we do and whatnot, and what conclusions come from it. But in terms of the policy debate, I don't have a role in that.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Thanks, Mike, for the presentation. It's really encouraging to see the return of investment. My question here, so this number is projected, as you mentioned. I'm not sure if we track the actual saving or not. Maybe that's the question to city manager or to you, if you can answer the question.
It's an issue of attribution. So to be able to say that this is the exact number, I can't. It's not subject to that auditable verification. It's an estimate.
Estimate, okay.
An estimate, and the numbers going forward are projections. So we don't know what they look like going forward. I think it's probably why a lot of my colleagues in offices across the country are reluctant to go down this path because of concerns around the perceived credibility of the numbers put forward.
I see.
So, for instance, in Toronto, where they've been doing this for many years, they're estimating an ROI that's closer to $12. And I'm not challenging their methodology or anything else, but I do know that my team has been instructed to take a very conservative approach in putting these numbers together.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Maybe that's the question to city managers. So is it possible for us to do some tracking to see what is the actual saving, if that's possible to do?
Thanks, Councillor. I mean, certainly we're happy to provide whatever information Council would find helpful around any of the specific audits and the outcomes. And if there's financial savings that are being attributed to those, we can do our best to estimate that. Again, in some cases, there's a number of factors, but yeah, happy to take whatever direction Council might issue on that.
Okay, thanks, Paul. My second question is, looks like there were almost $100,000 savings in terms of the contract services for this year. Would you expect the same thing for 2025?
I'm not expecting that
for
next year, just based on the nature of the work that we're planning to do, Councillor Joe, in particular in relation to IT security. Now, our ability to actually utilize those resources just depends on the availability of the appropriate contractors and the actual scope of the work that we're going to do there, which even that we haven't quite finished our first round of IT security audit work, we haven't quite determined what the next step will be.
Okay, thanks. So we'll fully expect to use all the budget allocated to the department for this year.
Could you say again, please?
So we're fully expected to use all the contract services money allocated to the audit.
Next year, yeah, that
for
is
next
the
year, yeah.
anticipation, yes.
Okay, next question. I'm looking at slide number 8. So it might be just a rounding issue. For the contract services, 76% for subject matter expert, 17% for QA, and 5% for legal. That's add up to 98%?
Yeah, it's just
Rounding, right? Yeah, okay. So I was wondering, where are those remaining 2%? Okay, good. That's all my question.
May I just say that is what I appreciate about you, Lenny. Councillor Joe, thank you for
Thanks.
diligence. External liaison, Sophia Tsui.
Thank you. So Mike, thanks for I think we get good value out of this team and budget as well. My question's more around the process. So have you constructed the audit plan for next year? Because normally that's how it would work. You decide what you're going to work on, and then you construct your budget based on that. And the question is more around, how do we know where you're looking at the things that would give us the greatest impact and value, and then are you staffed appropriately to look at those items?
So 2 comments in relation to that. One is, no, we don't have our audit plan next year. I'm required to release that on January 30th of every year, and it is released. But I don't bring it to the committee for comment or approval or anything because that's part of the independent nature of the office. In fact, the bylaw stipulates that I'm the only one that can create and change the audit plan. That being said, I'm obviously very interested in the committee's areas of interest, and I explicitly seek out that input from committee members when I do my annual check-ins with everybody, which we're just starting to schedule now.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. External liaison advisory, Carol Bellringer.
Thank you. It's a question I have that I suspect everybody in that room knows the answer to except me. And it's just, I see the biggest increase being salaries, and looking at, assuming the comparison is if last year had been fully staffed for the year and you didn't have the vacancy that was unexpected, it would be a 6% increase. How does that compare to the city salary increases this year?
The guidance that I've received from the city, Carol, this is entirely consistent with what's being planned around excluded staff in the city. But the details of that have yet to come to council for formal approval. So this is just based on their best understanding right now.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'll just add myself to the queue really quickly. And really more of a comment than a question. I think it would be great to see, steak is great, but I like a little sizzle, and it would be nice to see what we're anticipating for the year ahead when we're projecting the budget for the year ahead. That's all. Okay. Seeing no further questions, would somebody like to move the recommendations? Moved by Councillor Dominato, seconded by Councillor Joe. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, can I call a vote? And I'm going to pull up the voting queue for this. Please vote
Sure.
with your, yeah, Councillor
Sure,
Montague.
if I could get a voting assistant favor, please.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and that passes with none in opposition. Motion to adjourn by Councillor Kirby-Young, seconded by Councillor Joe. Those in favor say yay, opposed say nay. Motion carries unanimously. This meeting is adjourned. The next Auditor General Committee meeting is Thursday, December 5th, 2024 at 9:30 a.m. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.